You know that moment when your entire life changes, and you can pinpoint it to a single second? For most people, it's a phone call, a diagnosis, an accident. For me, it was a cup of coffee, 6:32 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the glowing numbers on my microwave, waiting for my coffee to reheat. You know that feeling, when you're not quite awake yet, standing there in your pajamas, and the whole world feels soft and quiet? That's where I was. In that peaceful bubble we all live in before the chaos of the day begins. My kitchen was bathed in that early morning light, the kind that makes everything look clean and new. I was thinking about absolutely nothing important. Maybe what I'd have for breakfast. Maybe whether I needed to fill up my gas tank. Normal things. Boring things. Safe things. And then I heard it. Clang. It was loud. Metallic. Sharp enough to cut through the morning silence like a knife. I paused, coffee mug halfway to my lips, and waited. Maybe it was construction, I thought. The neighborhood had been going through some changes lately. New families moving in, old houses getting facelifts. Nothing unusual. I was about to brush it off when... Clang. Clang. Closer this time. Much closer. This wasn't coming from down the street. This was coming from my property. I set my mug down slowly on the counter, that peaceful morning feeling evaporating in an instant. You know that gut instinct that tells you something's wrong? That little voice in the back of your head. It was screaming now. I walked toward my back window, my bare feet padding across the cold kitchen tile. I was still half convinced I'd look out and see nothing. Maybe a garbage truck, maybe the wind knocking something over. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. There were 3 men in my backyard. Not near my yard. Not close to the property line. In my backyard. They were holding metal fence posts. Industrial-looking ones. And one of them was actively digging a hole in my lawn. What the hell? The words came out before I could stop them. I didn't think. I just moved. I ran to my back door, threw it open, and burst outside. I wasn't wearing proper shoes, just those thin house slippers that do absolutely nothing against wet grass. But I didn't care. Hey, I shouted, my voice cutting across the yard. What are you doing? All 3 men stopped. The one with the shovel looked up. The other 2, who'd been holding a post, froze mid-lift. But here's the thing that got me. The thing that sent the first real spike of fear through my chest. None of them looked surprised. None of them looked guilty. They just looked at me, like I was the one interrupting them. That was my first warning sign, though I didn't fully recognize it yet. I said, "What are you doing?" I repeated, walking closer. And that's when I saw him. My neighbor. He was standing just beyond the men, on the other side of where they were working. Arms crossed. Watching. Not helping, just supervising. We'd never been close, him and me. He'd moved in about 2 years ago. We'd done the polite neighbor thing. Wave from the driveway, nod when getting the mail. But we'd never had a real conversation. Never had a barbecue together. Never borrowed sugar or a lawnmower. Looking back, maybe that should have told me something. I walked straight toward him, my heart pounding now, adrenaline replacing the morning grogginess. "Why are there people in my yard?" I asked. Not yelled. Not yet. I wanted an explanation first. He didn't even blink. "They're building a fence." I stared at him. "Yeah, I can see that. Why are they building it in my yard?" He shrugged. Actually shrugged. Like I'd asked him about the weather. "Because that's where the property line is." For a second, just a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard him. Or maybe he was joking. You know that disbelief you feel when something so absurd happens that your brain can't quite process it? "You're kidding," I said, and it came out as half statement, half question. "Nope." His face was completely emotionless. "Had the land surveyed last week. This is where the boundary is." My chest tightened. "That's not possible. I've lived here for 8 years. I know exactly where the property line is." "Well," he said, and I swear there was the tiniest hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Turns out you were wrong." That's when the cold feeling started spreading through my stomach. I turned slowly and looked at where the workers were placing the posts. And that's when I really saw it. The line they were building didn't just cut through the edge of my backyard. It wasn't running along where I thought the boundary was. It was heading straight toward my house. "No," I whispered. One of the workers drove another post into the ground with a heavy thunk. Then another. Each one closer to my home. Closer to my kitchen wall. "Stop." The word exploded out of me. "Stop right now." The workers hesitated. They looked at each other. Then they looked at my neighbor. And he, calm as anything, said 2 words. Keep going. And they did. They just kept working. Like I wasn't even there. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm. That I handled it like an adult. That I took a deep breath and called a lawyer. But I didn't. You can't do this. I was shouting now, really shouting. This is my property. That's my house. My neighbor finally took a few steps closer. His expression hadn't changed. Not a flicker of emotion. Not according to the survey, he said flatly. Then the survey is wrong. Take it up with the county. He was already turning away, like the conversation was over. Just like that. No discussion. No negotiation. No explanation. Just a fence, cutting through my life. By 9:15 that morning, the post had reached my house. I stood there in my backyard, still in my pajamas and slippers, watching in complete disbelief as one of the workers pulled out a measuring tape and marked a point on my kitchen wall. My kitchen wall. Are you seriously going to put a fence through my wall? My voice was shaking now. Not from anger. From something deeper. Shock, maybe. Disbelief. The worker didn't answer me. He didn't even look at me. He looked at my neighbor. And my neighbor said something I will never, ever forget. If that's where the line is, that's where the fence goes. Something inside me shifted in that moment. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder. Something quieter. Like the moment right before a storm hits, when the air goes still and you can feel the electricity building. All right, I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. All right, you want to do this? He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fence kept going. By noon, it was finished. A solid wooden fence. 6 feet tall. Built with professional precision. Cutting straight through my kitchen. Splitting it into 2 halves. I stood inside my own home, staring at this thing that now divided my space. My refrigerator was on one side. My stove was on the other. The sink? His side, apparently. Half my counter space? Gone. It looked like something out of a fever dream. Surreal. Impossible. I reached out with a trembling hand and touched the wood. It was real. Solid. Rough under my fingertips. This was actually happening. This wasn't a nightmare I'd wake up from. That evening, I sat alone in what used to be my kitchen. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the fence that now dominated my home. I tried to understand it. Tried to make sense of how things had escalated so quickly, so completely. And then it hit me. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. This was intentional. This was planned. He didn't just build a fence. He sent a message. A message that said, I can do whatever I want, and you can't stop me. A message that said, your home, your space, your peace of mind, none of it matters. A message that said, I win. And sitting there, in my divided kitchen, surrounded by the wreckage of my normal life, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead my case or try to reason with someone who clearly had no interest in reason. I wasn't even going to react. Not yet. Because if he thought this was over, if he thought he'd won, if he thought he could just walk away and enjoy his victory, then he had absolutely no idea what he'd just started. For 2 days, I didn't touch the fence. I didn't yell. I didn't call the police. I didn't march over to his house with a sledgehammer, though God knows the thought crossed my mind more than once. I did something else instead. Something he wasn't expecting. I waited. I watched. I thought. See, most people, when something like this happens to them, they react immediately. Emotionally. They let their anger control them. They make a scene. They do exactly what the other person expects them to do. And I could tell that's exactly what my neighbor was waiting for. Every single time I stepped outside, and I mean every time, he was there, leaning against his porch railing, standing in his driveway, pretending to check his mailbox, always watching me with this look, like he was waiting for me to snap, like he wanted me to lose it so he could call the cops and play the victim. But I didn't give him that satisfaction. I stayed calm. I went about my business. I acted like that fence dividing my kitchen in half was the most normal thing in the world. And you know what? That made him uncomfortable. I could see it in the way he shifted his weight when I walked by, the way his eyes followed me a little too long, the way his jaw tightened when I didn't react. He thought he'd broken me. He thought I'd accepted defeat. But what he didn't realize was that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. On the 3rd day, I made my first move. Not with a lawyer. Not with a demolition crew. Not with anything dramatic. With a phone call. I sat at my kitchen table, well, the half of my kitchen table that was still on my side of the fence, and dialed the number I'd found online. It rang 3 times. County Records Office, how can I help you? The voice on the other end was pleasant. Professional. Completely unaware that they were about to drop the first domino in what would become an avalanche. Yeah, hi, I said, keeping my voice calm and friendly. I need to request a copy of a property survey that was supposedly filed last week. The address is 214 Westbrook Lane. There was a pause. The sound of typing. Then another pause, longer this time. Sir, I'm not seeing any recent survey filed for that address. I sat up a little straighter. Could you check again, please? It would have been filed within the last week or 2. More typing. I could hear her clicking through screens. I've checked twice now. The last official survey on record for 214 Westbrook Lane is from 9 years ago. 9 years. Let that sink in for a second. I bought my house 8 years ago, which meant the last legitimate survey was done before I even lived here. Which meant one very important thing. Whatever document my neighbor was using to justify putting a fence through my kitchen wasn't official, wasn't registered, wasn't real. Thank you, I said quietly. That's exactly what I needed to know. I hung up and sat there in the quiet of my divided kitchen, staring at that fence. And for the first time since this nightmare started, I smiled. A real smile. You really messed up, I whispered to the empty room. The next morning, I did something I never thought I'd do. I knocked on his door. It was early, around 8 a.m. I could hear movement inside. The sound of a TV. Someone walking around. After a moment, the door opened. Halfway. He stood there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. Yeah, he said. Not good morning. Not can I help you? Just, yeah. I want to see the survey, I said simply. His expression changed immediately. That guarded suspicion melted into something else. Satisfaction. Smugness. Like this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Figured you'd come around eventually, he said. And I swear there was a hint of a smirk on his face. He disappeared into his house and came back a moment later holding a folded piece of paper. He handed it to me like he was presenting evidence in court. Like this single document proved he was right and I was wrong. I took it slowly, unfolded it carefully, and there it was. A property survey. Or at least, something that looked like a property survey. It had lines, measurements, coordinates, a stamp in the corner, a signature at the bottom. It was detailed. It was professional looking. It was convincing. Almost perfect. Almost. Because I noticed something most people wouldn't catch. The date. It wasn't stamped into the paper like official documents usually are. It was printed, computer generated. And the font was slightly different from the rest of the text on the page. My eyes scanned down to the seal at the bottom. The official-looking stamp that was supposed to verify this was legitimate. And I realized something else. The edges were too clean. Too perfect. Like it had been copied and pasted from a digital image rather than pressed into the paper with an actual seal. I looked up at him, my face completely neutral. Where'd you get this done? I asked. Licensed surveyor, he said quickly. Too quickly. That's the thing about liars. They over-explain. They rush to convince you before you have time to question them. I nodded slowly, refolding the paper. Mind if I take a picture of this? For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw his confidence waver. Just for a second. His smile faded. His eyes narrowed slightly. Why, he asked. So I can verify it with the county, I said calmly. Just want to make sure everything's legitimate. You understand. Silence. Complete, total silence. I could actually see him weighing his options. If he said no, it would look suspicious. If he said yes, I'd have evidence. Finally, he forced a shrug that was supposed to look casual, but came off stiff. Go ahead, he said. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures. Close-ups of the signature, the seal, the measurements, the date. Then I handed the paper back to him. Thanks, I said. And I walked away. That was all I needed. By that afternoon, I was sitting in a small office downtown, across the desk from a real estate attorney named Patricia Hendricks. She came highly recommended. Former prosecutor. 20 years of experience. The kind of lawyer who doesn't waste your time or sugarcoat things. I slid my phone across her desk. Tell me this is fake, I said. She picked up the phone and studied the images I'd taken. She zoomed in. Adjusted her reading glasses. Zoomed in more. For a full minute, she didn't say anything. Then she leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath. This, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, is either the absolute worst legitimate survey I have ever seen in my entire career. She paused. or it's a very good fake. I felt something cold settle in my chest. How bad are we talking? I asked. She tapped the screen, pointing to different sections of the document. Wrong formatting here. The labeling is inconsistent. And this seal? She zoomed in on the official-looking stamp. This seal isn't registered with the county. I'd bet money it's a digital copy pulled from the internet. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. So he built a fence through my house, based on a fake document. Patricia nodded. That's what it looks like. But here's the thing. She leaned forward, her expression serious. That's not even the worst part. I frowned. What do you mean? She looked me straight in the eyes. If we can prove he knowingly used a falsified survey to justify construction on your property, this isn't just a civil property dispute anymore. My heart started beating faster. This becomes criminal. The word hung in the air between us. Criminal. Not just a lawsuit. Not just a fine. Criminal charges. Fraud. Forgery. Possibly even trespassing and property damage. How do we prove it? I asked. Patricia smiled, a sharp, knowing smile. That's the fun part, she said. We gather evidence. We find out who really made this document. We talk to the workers who built the fence. And we build a case so airtight that he can't talk his way out of it. That night, I stood in my kitchen again. But this time, everything felt different. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't helpless. I was focused. Because now I had something my neighbor didn't have. Information. Evidence. A plan. But I still didn't act. Not yet. Because here's what I'd learned. Proof is good, but timing is everything. You don't show your hand too early. You don't let your opponent know what you're planning. You wait. You gather. You prepare. And then, when the moment is exactly right, you strike. 2 days later, I got the break I'd been waiting for. And it came from the last place I expected. One of the workers. I was pulling into my driveway after a long day when I saw him. Standing near the fence, looking around nervously like he wasn't sure he should be there. I recognized him immediately. He was the one who'd been operating the post-hole digger that first morning. I got out of my car slowly, trying not to spook him. You worked on this, right? I asked, gesturing to the fence. He nodded quickly. Yeah, listen, man, I didn't know. Didn't know what? I interrupted gently. He glanced around like he was worried someone might be watching, then stepped closer and lowered his voice. That it went through your house. We were told this was a clean boundary job. Standard fence installation. Nobody said anything about that. He pointed at my kitchen wall where the fence disappeared inside. I crossed my arms, keeping my voice calm and non-threatening. Who told you it was a standard job? He hesitated, then said the words I'd been hoping to hear. Your neighbor. Of course. Did you see any official documents? I asked. Permits? Surveys? Anything from the county? Another pause. He shook his head. No. He just showed us a piece of paper. Said everything was approved and legal. We had no reason not to believe him. I took a careful step closer. Would you be willing to say that again? On the record? Maybe in a statement or a deposition? His eyes widened. I could see the fear there. The realization that he might be caught up in something bigger than he'd thought. I don't want trouble, man. I just did the work I was hired to do. I know, I said quietly. And you're not in trouble. But he might be. And if this goes where I think it's going, the truth is going to come out either way. Wouldn't you rather be on the right side of it? Silence. Long, heavy silence. I could see him thinking, weighing his options, wondering if doing the right thing was worth the hassle. Then finally, he nodded. Yeah, he said. If it comes to it, I'll tell the truth. That was it. That was the moment everything changed. That night, I stood in my divided kitchen one more time. But I wasn't looking at a problem anymore. I was looking at leverage. Because now I had everything I needed. A fake survey that wasn't registered with the county. An attorney who knew exactly how to handle this. A witness who could testify that no legitimate documents were shown. And a neighbor who thought he'd already won. He thought he had control. He thought he'd outsmarted me. He thought the fence was the end of the story. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he'd just handed me every single piece of ammunition I needed to destroy him. And the best part? He had absolutely no idea what was coming. I pulled out my phone, opened my attorney's contact, and typed out 3 simple words. Let's start. I hit send. And just like that, the war began. The court notice arrived without warning. No white SUV crawling past the fence. No envelope tied to the gate. No strange footsteps on the gravel before sunrise. Just a formal envelope in the mailbox, mixed in with ordinary things that had nothing to do with any of this. A utility bill, a feed store flyer, a county circular, and then that. Stamped. Filed. Real. I stood there in the driveway, opening it with my thumb, already knowing it wasn't going to be anything small. The second I saw the county seal and the case caption across the top, my stomach dropped. Pine Ridge Property Association had filed for enforcement. I read that line once. Then again. Then I just stood there longer than I should have, staring at the page while the wind moved through the field behind me and the truck engine ticked as it cooled. Up to that point, some part of me had still been trying to believe this was intimidation dressed up to look official. Harassment with clipboards. Pressure with made-up confidence. A dead association trying to bluff a new owner who didn't know the history well enough yet. But court changes the tone of everything. Once somebody files papers, signs a name, and drags your property into a legal room, it stops feeling strange and starts feeling expensive. This wasn't just pressure anymore. This was escalation. The farmhouse felt different after that. I laid the notice on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time under the weak overhead light. Same old wood. Same cracked corners on the table. Same drafts slipping around the back window. But the room didn't feel peaceful that night. It felt like the place was waiting with me. That was the part people don't really understand unless they've gone through something like it. A legal threat doesn't just sit on paper. It gets into your routines, into the air of the house, into the way you wake up in the morning, and the way your mind keeps circling the same questions after dark. How far are they willing to take this? Who's really behind it? What do they actually want? And maybe the worst question of all, what happens if they don't stop? The next morning, I started calling attorneys. The first office never called me back. The second one listened just long enough to tell me that old covenant and association disputes in rural counties could get messy, which is lawyer language for expensive and exhausting. The third attorney told me to bring everything, not just the court notice. Everything. So I did. I brought my deed, title paperwork, closing documents, county maps, copies of the dues notice, photos of the lock on the gate, notes from the so-called inspections, screenshots of archived records, even the handwritten warning that said they were never supposed to be active again. His office sat in an old brick building near the courthouse square, the kind of place that looked like it had handled disputes over land, fences, wills, and bad contracts for half a century. Inside, there were shelves of thick books no one touched unless they had to, and framed maps of county parcels that looked older than most of the people living on them. He didn't rush. That mattered. He read every page carefully. He asked for dates, asked me to repeat exact phrases they had used, asked who had shown up, how many times, whether anyone had introduced themselves formally, whether I had signed anything at closing that could be twisted into acknowledgement. I answered everything I could. Then he sat back in his chair, looked at the old map I had printed from county records, and said the one sentence that changed the whole way I understood what was happening. This HOA shouldn't be able to function like this, unless someone is actively pushing it. I remember going quiet after that, because until then, I had still been thinking in smaller terms. I had been asking whether Pine Ridge was technically real, whether it still existed on paper, whether some old legal description had accidentally survived inside county records. But that wasn't the real issue anymore. The real issue was that this thing wasn't moving on its own. Somebody was driving it. Somebody had gone back into old filings, found a dormant structure, and decided to use it. That meant this wasn't random. It was structured, intentional, organized. And if it was organized, then the annual dues had never been the point. The dues were only a test. A way to see if I would bend early. A way to see if I would pay first and ask questions later. My attorney tapped the side of the file and said, "Entities like this don't suddenly wake up on their own after years of silence. Somebody has a reason." I asked him, "Can they actually enforce this?" He gave me the kind of answer that made me understand how ugly the truth was. They may not need to win to get what they want. That sat in me like a stone. Because he was right. Some fights aren't built around winning in court. They're built around making the other side tired, scared, isolated, and expensive enough to force a decision. Sell. Settle. Walk away. Give up. That's how pressure works when it's wearing a tie instead of a mask. The days leading up to court became a blur of paperwork and memory. I wrote out timelines, printed maps, labeled photographs, reconstructed every interaction from the moment I first saw that white SUV on the road. The first warning by the fence. The dues notice. The line about not checking far enough back. The lock on the gate. The phone call with the woman who said, "It does here." The inspectors measuring my barn and calling my presence unauthorized occupancy. The handwritten warning. When I laid it all out in order, it stopped looking like scattered harassment. It looked like a campaign. Court day came gray and heavy. Not dramatic. Not stormy. Just the kind of overcast morning that makes everything feel unfinished. I got there early with my attorney. The courthouse was small compared to the ones you see on television, but that almost made it worse. Smaller rooms make things feel more personal, more local, more dangerous in a quiet way. I saw them before we went inside. Two of the same men who had been on my property were there, dressed in pressed shirts and clean shoes, carrying themselves with the same confidence they had shown while walking across my land without permission. Their lawyer stood beside them with a neat stack of folders, calm and polished, like this was just another routine matter. For him, maybe it was. For me, it was surreal. A few weeks earlier, I had been clearing brush from a fence line and thinking about garden beds. Now I was about to sit in court while strangers tried to argue that I owed obedience to an association I had never agreed to. Inside, everything was stripped down to wood, paper, and voices kept lower than normal. The judge looked like a man who had seen every kind of rural dispute imaginable and had lost interest in theater years ago. The HOA's lawyer spoke first. Smooth voice. Confident posture. The kind of man who knew exactly how to make something questionable sound ordinary. "This is simply enforcement of community obligations," he said. Community obligations. I remember hearing those words and feeling something cold move through me. There was no community out there. No active board I had been informed of. No maintained neighborhood entrance. No functioning association meetings. No ordinary chain of authority anybody could point to in real time. There was land. There was history. And there were people trying to weaponize both. But he kept talking, using language designed to sound bigger than the truth. Historic covenants. Preserved authority. Recorded restrictions. Continuing obligations. He didn't need the story to feel honest. He just needed it to sound established. Then my attorney stood. His tone was simple, which made it stronger. "There is no active governing authority over this property," he said. "My client purchased this land without disclosure of any functioning, enforceable association structure. What exists here is not a normal operating HOA. What exists is a dormant paper entity being used to create pressure after the fact." That got the room's attention. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was clear. The HOA side kept pushing their angle. Pine Ridge had existed. Pine Ridge had never been formally dissolved. Certain obligations had survived in records. Certain boundaries had once included my parcel. Then one of the representatives smiled and said, "Dormant does not mean dead." The way he said it mattered. That wasn't confusion. That wasn't legal uncertainty. That was strategy. He said it like someone who had already built his whole plan around that sentence. Dormant does not mean dead, meaning they had prepared for resistance. Meaning they knew exactly how thin the legal ground was, and had decided it was still enough to stand on if it scared people first. The hearing went back and forth over filings, maps, records, authority, and enforcement. But the moment that changed everything was smaller than I expected. My attorney asked one question. Who authorized reactivation? That was it. No speech. No performance. Just a direct question. And for the first time since the hearing started, they paused. Not long, but long enough. Long enough for the room to feel it. Because that question reached past all the language they had been hiding behind. Past community obligations. Past historic continuity. Past the old paperwork and dormant lines on old maps. An old association can exist in records. Fine. But who brought it back? Who started sending notices? Who ordered inspections? Who decided annual dues were suddenly payable again? Who gave authority shape and motion after years of silence? Their lawyer answered eventually, but not cleanly. He slid into vague language about preserved authority and procedural continuity and internal standing. It sounded technical. It did not sound direct. And direct was what mattered. Afterward, outside the courthouse, my attorney gave me the version without legal polish. This isn't just an HOA dispute, he said. Somebody is using old associations to target land through technical loopholes. That was the real realization. My farm wasn't random. It was selected. I asked him why somebody would do that. He looked out toward the street for a second before answering. To create leverage, he said. Maybe to force a sale? Maybe to block use? Maybe to pressure owners until the land becomes easier to acquire. Paper pressure is cheaper than direct negotiation when someone thinks they can make you panic. When I drove back to the farm that evening, I didn't turn on the radio. I just drove in silence, thinking about that one word. Selected. By the time I reached the property, I wasn't seeing it the same way anymore. I stood at the gate and looked over everything the way they might have looked at it. The field, the tree line, the barn, the access road, the water, the distance from town, the privacy, the possibility. I had seen peace. Somebody else had seen value. And whatever that value was, it had been enough to wake a dead structure and send it after me. For the next few weeks, the case kept moving in the background. My attorney filed responses. More documents were requested. More old records surfaced. We found enough inconsistencies and missing authority that their position started looking weaker the longer anyone looked at it directly. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure stopped. No letters. No calls. No SUV on the road. No inspectors. No fresh notices at the gate. Nothing. At first, I didn't believe it. Silence feels different after sustained pressure. It doesn't feel peaceful right away. It feels suspicious. Like the next move is just taking longer than usual. Every morning, I checked the mailbox expecting another official envelope. Every time I heard tires on gravel, I looked toward the road. Every trip into town carried the same thought in the back of my mind. What if they've already filed something else? But nothing came. Days turned into weeks. The quiet stayed quiet. My attorney eventually called and told me what I had already started to suspect. They were backing off. Not because they had suddenly developed decency. Because they had been pushed into a place where proving actual lawful reactivation would expose too much. He told me we had enough to keep fighting if we had to, but the strategy had changed. The pressure campaign had failed. And once pressure fails, people using loopholes usually don't like sunlight very much. That should have felt like a victory. And it did. But not the simple kind. Because by then I understood something I hadn't understood when I first bought the farm. Owning land isn't always just about paying for it. Sometimes it's about defending it from people who think paper can erase presence. People who think old records matter more than lived reality. People who think if they make ownership hard enough, they can turn your exhaustion into their opportunity. One evening, after almost a month of silence, I got one last message. Unknown number. No name. No greeting. Just 3 lines. You weren't the target. The land was. And now they know you won't sell. I read it once in the kitchen. Then I walked outside with my phone still in my hand. The sun was dropping low over the field, throwing long gold light across the grass. The barn stood dark at the edge of the property. The same wind moved through the trees the way it had on the day I first saw the place. Same land. Same silence. But now I understood both of them better. This had never been about dues. The money was never the point. The HOA language was never the point. The warnings, the inspections, the legal filing, the word occupancy, the talk of compliance and penalties, it had all been pressure applied in stages. First confusion, then intrusion, then intimidation, then legal cost, then fatigue. They wanted me uncertain, then defensive, then tired, then ready to ask the one question people ask when pressure gets expensive enough. What would it take to make this go away? And when a person asks that question, somebody is always waiting with an offer. That was the whole game. Not community standards. Not neighborhood rules. Not some forgotten duty attached to old rural land. Ownership. Who gets to keep land? Who gets pushed off it? And how politely that pressure can be disguised. I stood there looking over the property until the light started to fade. And somewhere in that fading light, everything that had happened finally settled into one clear truth. I had not bought a troubled property. I had bought a piece of land someone else thought they could eventually corner. And when I refused to bend, refused to pay, refused to panic, they learned something they had not planned for. I wasn't leaving. That mattered more than any court notice, more than any dormant filing, more than any polished lawyer standing in a courtroom pretending this was routine. Because land changes when you fight for it. Not physically, but personally. It stops being just a purchase. It becomes a line. And once you draw that line clearly enough, the people pushing from the other side have to decide whether they really want what comes next. I changed the lock on the gate. My lock this time. Heavy. Solid. Mine. I posted new signs along the fence line. Not because signs stop determined people, but because clarity matters. So does record. So does making sure nobody can later pretend they misunderstood where your boundary was or how you felt about strangers crossing it. Then I went back to work. I repaired the porch boards that had been sagging near the steps. I cleared more brush around the barn. I walked the perimeter with a notebook and started marking the fence posts that needed replacing before winter. And that was the best part of all of it. Not the court response. Not the legal strategy. Not even the fact that they backed off. The best part was this. They had tried to turn my home into a dispute. And in the end, it was still my home. The farmhouse still leaned slightly the way it had the day I first saw it. The wind still moved through the tall grass. The nights were still dark enough to make the stars look close. And the silence, real silence, had come back. Only now it meant something different. Before, it had felt like escape. Now it felt like something earned. I stayed out there until the first stars came up and the field turned silver in the dark. The house creaked behind me in the cooling air, and somewhere beyond the fence line a night bird called once and went quiet again. That was when I realized the story had ended in the only way that mattered. Not with an apology. Not with some dramatic confession about who had been behind Pine Ridge. Not with a perfect legal ending where every bad actor gets named and marched into daylight. Life doesn't always give you that. Sometimes the ending is simpler. Sometimes the ending is that they tried and failed. Sometimes the ending is that the pressure didn't work. The land stayed where it was. So did I. And if anyone out there was still watching from a distance, still studying old maps, still hoping I would eventually get tired enough to let go, they had their answer. I wasn't paying dues to a ghost. I wasn't surrendering my farm to loopholes. And I wasn't selling peace back to the people who tried to steal it from me. I bought that old farm because it felt like freedom. I kept it because I learned freedom isn't something you find once. It's something you defend. And standing there in the dark, looking out across the land they had tried to take from me one notice at a time, I knew one thing for sure. This place was mine, and it was going to stay that way.